Malignaggi here for Paulie TV. You know, there's certain discussions and certain topics that just always come up in boxing, and some of them are highly discussed. You know, what guy in this generation will beat this other guy in this generation. Those are typically the biggest ones. You know, Mike Tyson against anybody in history, right? Muhammad Ali against anybody in history. Those are always highly discussed and then argued over topics. Also, you know, another topic that gets argued about is, you know, the dominant fighters of every era, right? And it's actually one that got me a little bit of hot water. The Eastern European style is one that's gaining and starting to gain momentum and getting curiosity out of people in boxing. You know, in a world that is more and more globalized and people kind of sort of link everything together, things are starting to become more and more morphed, and there's less and less of, you know, even in boxing, there's less and less of specific culture in one part of the world than there is in another part of the world. Sort of the cultures are sort of intermixing a little bit more and more as we go forward. Whether that's a good or bad thing is a separate conversation. But what I'm saying is, this is happening even in boxing. You know, there used to be a definitive Western boxing style, especially in North America, European boxing style, and then even an Eastern European boxing style. You know, there was the, you know, upper body movement, more come from North American fighters. The heavy attack to the body of the South and Central American fighters, and even Mexican fighters, obviously. The Europeans with their stand-up boxing style, more technical, less hip movement, less upper body movement, but more focus on the legs. And of course, the Eastern European style, which also was a bit more stiff, as far as not a lot of head movement, but focused a lot on sitting and closing the fist very tightly, very good boxing fundamentals, and punching hard. These were sort of the stereotypical styles that we saw in each of the hemispheres of the world. I think nowadays, today, they sort of all mix in together, right? We see Lomachenko, a fighter from Eastern European descent, sort of have a very fluid style. Almost reminds you of a little bit, that makes you think a little bit that the North American influence is sort of in his style. It's a hybrid style. You know, obviously he's very fundamentally sound and obviously a terrific fighter. But if you can, my opinion is, if you can hybrid all the styles together the correct way, you make an excellent fighter like a Lomachenko. You know, Lomachenko is not your quintessential Eastern European fighter where, you know, they're looking to punch hard, very stiff, fundamentally excellent, and even if you hit them, you don't break them. You know, I think Dimitri Bivol is more of an Eastern European fighter in that he's high up, has the high guard, but he's also not very planted, right? He's also a guy who uses his legs a little bit more than a lot of quintessential Eastern European fighters would, right? I mean, you think of the Eastern European stereotype. You think of, you know, Rocky IV, Ivan Drago, you know, this guy who hits hard, stoic, no personality, sort of ice in his veins. But then you look at Lomachenko and Usyk, and they're always joking around, you know, they've got a hybrid boxing style, and all of a sudden you realize that, once again, you know, the hybrid personalities in boxing styles are sort of taking over more and more. The rigid style, the technical fundamentals, the harsh harping on the fundamentals comes from that old Soviet regime and the old communist regime where, you know, everything was so soldier-like, no matter what they did in life, right, including their sports. Very regimented, very fundamental. You look, if anybody has seen the hockey documentary Red Army, for example, again, the hockey team was very regimented in the way they did their drills and the way they had to play their hockey and all this other stuff. They played beautiful hockey, by the way, but that's a separate sport. But nonetheless, it goes to show you that in their sports and in anything they did, the culture was very regimented, and it was highly dependent on success. Like it was a no BS culture. Like no matter what you did, the results had to come down to success. If not, you were replaced quickly or you were eliminated quickly in that. And so it was very, and because of that, you know, the success rate was very high when you compare it to the West, especially that there was the Cold War generation. You know, they had to compete against the West. They were not allowed to turn pro because of the communist regime. And in the amateurs, people will agree with this, anybody who's done some boxing, in the amateurs, it's hard to have an awkward style and be successful. It's hard to have a style that's not fundamentally sound and be successful. In the pros, you can do it because you're fighting over the long haul and over a lot of rounds. Sometimes you break a fundamental guy down with some awkward moves and some awkward styles. But in a short fight like the amateurs, fundamentals wins you fights. So you will rarely find a guy who's not fundamentally great in the amateurs that will win a lot in the amateurs. So for that reason, the Soviet style, the Eastern European style in general, was very regimented on fundamentals, very strong fundamentals, and a lot of them were good punchers. A lot of them were good punchers. I think since 1990, when the Iron Curtain fell in '89 with the Berlin Wall, and then the Soviet Union fell in 1990, you started to see some of these guys turn pro, but the culture was still not completely westernized yet. You know what I'm saying? If you really think about it, because a lot of those guys still didn't turn pro. If you think about somebody I remember, Gaider Bekov, who won the gold medal and beat Gennady Golovkin in the gold medal match, never turned pro. He never turned pro. He beat Golovkin in the finals of the Olympics in 2000 and never turned pro. There was a welterweight from Russia named Oleg Saitov, who I think won 2 gold medals. I know he medaled twice for sure. I don't know if they were both gold. But Oleg Saitov never turned pro as well. So even in the post-communist regime or era, the culture was still sort of bleeding over, and the mentality still hadn't completely changed. I think now, we're 30 years removed from the end of the Soviet Union, and more Eastern Euros, they typically do turn pro. I don't think you see as many just staying in the amateurs. I think the goal for all of them is to eventually, to turn pro. But this rigid style has still remained, but it's sort of become more and more of a hybrid as you see more and more of these fighters coming to North America to have training camps, also to North America to fight in general. While at that time, everything was regimented in the Soviet training camps and all that, So looking back, though, they always had a lot of success. I always say this. People say, oh, the old school boxing is better than the new school boxing. Those guys were better. And the main reason I disagree with this, besides the fact that people always get fundamentally stronger, bigger, stronger, faster, and that's the same with athletes. Besides that, the reason I think modern boxing is more difficult to succeed in is because the Iron Curtain opened in 1990. And ever since then, professional boxers have had to deal with Eastern Europeans. So it's an extra race of people. It's an extra kind of style. It's an extra influx of high-level boxing that has joined the fray. And so to become a champion, now you've got to also go through these kind of fighters as well. While before 1990, to become a world-class professional boxer, you had to beat what you had to beat. But the Eastern Europeans were not involved. You didn't have to beat any of those guys. Once you turned pro, you didn't have to beat any of those guys. And a lot of times, those guys who had success in the pros had been knocked off in the amateurs by Cuban fighters or Soviet fighters or so on and so forth, So and you never got to see how any of those Eastern European fighters might develop, There's always a question. The people always talk about the greatest amateur boxer in history was Teofilo Stevenson, the Cuban guy, And Teofilo Stevenson won 3 gold medals, as did Felix Savon later on. But people always say, oh, he was offered so much money to defect and fight Muhammad Ali, and he just was too loyal to his country, and it really robbed us of a potentially great fight. But, Stevenson had his own rivalries in the amateurs, and I'm going to give you a guy that beat Stevenson the only 2 times he fought him, and actually knocked him out one of those times. That guy was from the Soviet Union, a Russian fighter named Igor Vysotsky, who in 1973 knocked out Teofilo Stevenson in their first meeting. And then he ended up beating Stevenson again at another competition where he didn't knock him out, but he gave him a couple of 8 counts. So the Vysotsky was, from what I'm gathering, from what we can probably tell, Stevenson was an excellent fighter. To knock out Stevenson and then the other time when beating him and enforcing some 8 counts in the process was a monstrous puncher. The problem with Vysotsky is he had a lot of problem with cuts. And in an era where amateur boxers didn't compete with headgears, he was dealing with a lot of cuts. The story is that in the 1976 Olympics, Stevenson had already won gold in, I think, 72. And so in the 1976 Olympics, he'd been knocked out by Vysotsky in 73. So the story is that the Cuban team brought 2 super heavyweights to the 1976 Olympics. One was going to compete in case the Soviets brought Vysotsky. And the second one was Teofilo Stevenson. He was going to be the one to compete at the Olympics in case Vysotsky was not at the Olympics. Well, as it turned out, Vysotsky had been cut prior to the Olympics, and he could not participate in the 1976 Olympics. So Teofilo Stevenson took charge, and he was put into the roster to compete at the 76 Olympics, and the backup fighter the Cubans had brought did not compete. Stevenson ended up winning his second of 3 gold medals, and Vysotsky never got his chance to fight him again. I think he had beaten him for the second time earlier in 1976 at an Olympic warm-up tournament, and like I said, that was where he beat him on points before some 8 counts. 3 years earlier in 73, he knocked out Stevenson. By the time 1980 came around, Vysotsky was kind of worn out, and he was eliminated. He was beaten by another Russian fighter in the qualifiers to the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, mind you, which was, the Soviets hosted. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Stevenson won his 3rd gold medal at those Olympics. And he beat that, I believe he beat that Russian fighter that beat Vysotsky in the trials in the Soviet Union, in the USSR Soviet Union. The guy that knocked off Vysotsky in the qualifiers for the Olympics ended up losing in the Olympic finals to Stevenson in 80. And I think that's where the 3rd gold medal for Stevenson comes from. Again, look all this up. This is some pretty cool information, and offhand, I may be missing some small details, but the bottom line is, this is what I'm talking about with the Eastern European style. There's a lot of fighters who in the past didn't even get recognition because they were not allowed to turn pro. Another fun tidbit about Vysotsky is that Muhammad Ali did a world tour. Muhammad Ali was unbelievable, bro. He went everywhere and just did boxing exhibitions with everybody and on these tours, and this is why he was kind of a people's champion. And he went over to the USSR and did a boxing exhibition with Vysotsky, and Ali, even after the exhibition, was like, man, that guy hits hard, So Vysotsky would have been probably a fun guy to see in that era, and especially in an era where, can you imagine if there was no communism? You would have had Ali and all those great heavyweights, the most fun heavyweight era in history, in my opinion. And then you would have had, in addition to them, you would have had a Vysotsky and a Teofilo Stevenson also in the pros, if not for the existence of communism. I mean, the potentials are just unbelievable for me. When you come to these kind of discussions, these kind of topics, and what could have and might have happened. So stylistically, the Eastern European style, when it comes to somebody like Dmitry Bivol, for example, high guard, stand-up style, stand-up high. Again, you don't typically see a lot of upper body movement in the traditional Eastern European style. Now, you see some of that as they've hybrided. You see a little bit of that. Even with Usyk, who's a bigger guy, and obviously a lot with Lomachenko and guys like that. And there's also some others. But Bivol seems to fight a little bit in the old school Eastern European style. High guard, fundamentally high hands, shooting right from that position. And stands up high as well. Not a lot of upper body movement, and he uses his legs in and out a lot. So he stands very, very tall. And as you can see, Bivol uses this to his advantage tremendously, because he has a great recognition of where his range is and where his distance is and how to get those punches off. You notice this a lot in the Canelo fight. And the right hand is always, being that it's high guard and always in position, is always ready to counter the left hook when it catches on the arms. You don't usually see the upper body movement on these traditional Eastern European styles. So a lot of those shots, if he's going to slip them, he's going to use his legs. Otherwise, they play the position game where they're going to block right from there, not lose position. And this gives the option to counter with the right hand when catching the left hook. With shorter fighters, obviously, you think of a shorter Eastern European fighter, you think of Vasyl Lomachenko, who to me is a hybrid and he's a unique fighter even in the European sense style. Obviously, I have seen some lesser-known Eastern European fighters now, even in the pros, that have a little bit of this, have implicated a little bit of this style as well. So this Lomachenko for me is a hybrid. The pawing jab is basically to get you to react. He's looking to get you to react. Keep in mind, Lomachenko is also a southpaw, right? So he's looking to get you to react. If you don't react, he's just going to attack you right from there. But he's measuring you. He's setting his distance and he's measuring you. If you don't react very well, if he's already got you overthinking and you don't react, he knows he can be aggressive right off that paw, right? But if you react, he's setting out that pawing jab to sort of bait you to react, so he can then make you pay on top of that. The point of that pawing jab is to create counterpunching opportunities and also to look for the reaction time of the opponent, if there isn't any. As he beats up on his opponent more and more and more, he's going to realize that the pawing jab gets no reaction, and he's going to still use it to be safe, obviously, so he doesn't enter the punch zone recklessly, but nonetheless, it's going to show him that there's no reaction and he can just be directly aggressive and change angles off of that. Again, the change of angles on Lomachenko is very unique. I don't even see that in a lot of Eastern European fighters, the ability to change angles so well. I mean, keep in mind, this kid from the womb was bred to be a fighter. I mean, his father put him in dance classes when he was just starting to walk. He put him in sambo judo lessons, which I think translates well to his inside game. And then, of course, boxing, and he stuck strictly with boxing from his teenage years. So this is a very specific, regimented kind of Eastern European fighter, a unique one even in his own right, because I think he was born and bred from the womb to be a fighter, and he's a hybrid in every sense of the word, in my opinion. A lot of the footwork when it comes to Eastern Euros is basically in and out. You don't see a lot of pivoting. sort of, you think about a Gennady Golovkin, you know, where he's in and he's out when he's boxing, especially when he's boxing Canelo, because a lot of times Golovkin is just coming forward, and that's also another variation of the Eastern Euro, the pressure fighter, the high guard pressure fighter who's just walking you down and breaking you with heavy hands. But even when Golovkin was boxing with Canelo, the linear footwork, the in and out, and even obviously, again, going back to Dmitry Bivol, the ins and outs that they use, set up punching range. They make you come up short, and then they attack you, or they change range on you, they confuse you, and then they attack you, using those straight punches. If you're a footwork guy and you're in and out, a lot of times your straight punches are your bread and butter. Also, one thing you'll notice about many Eastern Euros, and again, Lomachenko doesn't count in this because he's the hybrid that sort of takes the cake, but a lot of Eastern European fighters, they do not pivot. North American fighters more so use pivots on their foot, where you're planted and you'll just spin around, using your front foot to spin yourself around and change the angle off of a pivot. You do not usually see Eastern European fighters pivot. They usually change directions in straight lines or left to right, and obviously they rely more on their high guard and sense of positioning than anything else. The pivot brings sort of an athletic version to the table. It's something North American fighters, I think, use more than anything else. I was taught this when I was boxing. I was taught this in the first 6 months or so that I was boxing, but I still had to learn to understand it. I don't usually see many European fighters in general pivot, but Eastern European fighters typically don't pivot at all. They're usually, again, regimented fundamentally, front forward or back, and left or right. And again, when you start to see the pivot kind of guys like a Lomachenko, that's a hybrid style. Again, he's unique even to the Eastern European style.